Hi, I'm Ozie Hall. In 1793, Count C.F. Volney, a French historian who studied ancient Egypt, said, "Those piles of ruins which you see in that narrow valley watered by the Nile are the remains of opulent cities, the pride of the ancient kingdom of Ethiopia. Behold the wrecks of her metropolis, of Thebes with her 100 palaces, the parent of cities and monument of the caprice of destiny. There a people, now forgotten, discovered, while others were yet barbarians, the elements of the arts and sciences. A race of men now rejected from society for their black skin and woolly hair, founded on the study of the laws of nature, those civil and religious systems which still govern the universe." A few years later, in the early 1800s, after a number of European scholars began to examine ancient Egypt and conclude that this was a Black civilization, that all of the high culture of ancient Egypt that contributed toward the advance of human civilization, that developed the first systems of mathematics, the first calendar system, the first religious systems, that developed the first sophisticated medical technology and building technology, that developed the first atomic theory, that made amazing discoveries that they're still trying to decipher. These researchers attributed this to Black people, and it caused an alarm in the white community, and particularly amongst the racists and those people who benefited from slavery and the oppression of Black people, because they built the system based upon the propaganda that Black people were nothing but heathens, cannibals, and savages, that we didn't have any civilization or culture, that we didn't contribute anything to the world. And because these white scholars came out and refuted this point of view with factual information, a new science was developed called Egyptology. And Egyptology wasn't about, just coming up to really study ancient Egypt. It was designed to disprove and discredit and create a propaganda machine against those scholars who came out and said that ancient Egyptian civilization was a Black civilization. This becomes very significant in terms of us understanding the role, the critical role that ancient Egypt played. Because if we go back in history and look at the achievements of ancient Egypt, and then look at the connection between ancient Egyptian Egypt, the Blacks who created ancient Egypt, and the modern Black people today in America. If we look at that, make that connection, it's a connection that is only discussed in very small academic circles. The average Black person out in the community has no idea, no connection. The average young person has no clue, because there's no institution that has put all this information together and teach it and transmit it to the next generation. This is what we need to be talking about. We need to bring our history all together into a way that we can transmit it from one generation to the next. So let me just kind of go back and look at ancient Egyptian civilization. First of all, one of the things that Professor Sheikh Anta Diop, in his book entitled African Origin of Civilization, he points out, is that when you look at Mesopotamian civilization, you don't see um, the the artifacts that you see in ancient Egypt. You see some mud brick type buildings that, that basically melted when it rained and that have been destroyed, that weren't able to stand the test of time. So you don't see the sophisticated technology of geopolymer concrete or the use of the mathematics system until much later. But Europeans attempted to make it look like, well, civilization didn't start in Africa. It started in Mesopotamia. And this has been the narrative because they tried to line it up to the Bible and make it correspond to the Bible. But when we began to actually look at and unravel the evidence, there's a passage in the Book of Coming Forth by Day, which is ancient Egyptian writing that goes back to the Papyrus of Menai and the Papyrus of Hunefer. And if we go back and look at those documents to go back as far as 4100 BC, what we find is a passage of scripture that says, we come from the beginning of the Nile at the foot of the Mount of the Moon. And the European scholars who translated it say that on the end of that sentence, we come from the beginning of the Nile at the foot of the Mount of the Moon. They say where God happy dwells. And when they say God happy, they're using their frame of reference in terms of understanding theology. But if you look at it, what they're really saying is that we come from the beginning of the Nile where the divine hippopotamus dwells, or the sacred hippopotamus. That doesn't mean they're worshiping hippopotamus. They're just respected as a creature in nature. But the Leakey family, who were archaeologists and anthropologists, they were studying in searching for the origin of man. And based on this scripture, after studying the Bible and digging and looking for human remains and then studying the Book of Coming Forth, it led them to a place called the Alluvial Gorge along Lake Tanganyika. And this dig that they did, they discovered the bones of Zinjanthropus basi, whom they called Lucy. Africans called her Mambujige, the mother of humanity. And then subsequently, Dr. Rebecca Kahn, who is an eminent cell biologist, used DNA mitochondria studies to determine that the Black woman was the mother of humanity based on DNA mitochondria, because the Black woman possesses the characteristics, the genetic characteristics of all of the races and all of the people from all over the world. But all of the people all over the world don't have all the genetic characteristics of the Black woman, which showed that she was the master gene, that she is the mother of humanity, that in her is the capacity to create every other group of people, every other race on the planet. And so in terms of looking at the evidence that developed over time, it became very clear that people, humans, were born in Africa and then developed and radiated and spread out all over the globe. Now, when we look at this, this model of the archaeological evidence and look at the DNA evidence, look at a variety of different areas of evidence, including linguistic evidence, we go back and see the cradle of human civilization is in ancient Egypt. And now there's a body of research that has established that not only did ancient Egypt develop, over 100 pyramids and develop all types of sophisticated building structures. They came up with the first medical text under Imhotep that that looked at, that documented over 750 plants in their medicinal use as medicine, the first pharmacology manual. In addition to that, there were studies of for the pulse and circulation, abscesses and burns, and studies in gynecology, and studies in the human, organ systems. And we began to look at all of these things that were developed in early times in ancient Egypt that became the foundation of modern medicine. Imhotep was considered the god of medicine to the Greeks. He was worshipped under the Greek name for Imhotep, Asclepius. When we began to go back and look at the numerical system that we call Hindu or Arabic numerals, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, it's been found in the first step pyramid of Saqqara. And we know now that it is an African numerical system and not an Arabic or Hindu system. And we can go back and look at the development of the pyramids, where, they have this theory that these stones were cut and drugged for, hundreds and hundreds of miles from quarries, and that they were, this was all done by slaves, and that the ancient Egyptians enslaved a bunch of people. But we know now that none of that is true, that the pyramids were actually done by paid work crews, and they use techniques using geopolymer concrete. So there's not a single cut stone in the pyramids. They're all cast stones that were poured. In addition to that, we know that they had a solar technology that was capable of melting granite and liquefying granite, and they made all types of pottery and vases, and they made all types of artifacts, and statues and images, obelisks, and all types of things that they made out of granite and other types of stone that they used their solar lenses to make molten stone, to produce these various artifacts. In addition to that, we know that they developed the meter as a unit of measure based on a drop of water, and that they developed the concept of pi long before Pythagoras, and that they also developed the golden ratio, and they developed a system of sacred geometry that was used in building systems in ancient Egypt. And they built some of the most permanent and lasting architecture that's ever existed on the face of the earth. And they developed the first system of moral laws in the negative confessions, which we know that the 10 Commandments of the Bible were actually extracted or copied from. And major passages from the Bible, from the books of Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, we know now that there are manuscripts that predated even the existence of Abraham that were found in ancient Egypt that show that, were these that were copied verbatim and put into the Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. So we also know that some of the stories, like the story of Joseph, comes from the tale of two brothers, or in the story of Cain and Abel, the tale of two brothers, and that there are a number of ancient Egyptian stories and myths that were copied pretty much directly from ancient Egyptian history and culture and mythology. And so in terms of when we began to take a look at this history, even we look at Jesus and Mary. Before Jesus and Mary, there was the Heru, born of the Virgin Isis. And there's documentation going back more than 4,100 years before the birth of Jesus Christ, and their lives are parallel to each other. The stories, are the parallels between the stories are so identical that it's very clear that the later story was copied from the earlier story that existed in ancient Egypt. So when we began to look at this history and the achievements of these ancient Egyptians, one of the things that we have come to understand and that research has borne out is that ancient Egypt did not start in the north by migrants from the so-called Middle East or from Mesopotamia. It actually started in the south, in the area of modern-day Sudan, northern and southern Sudan, and that this civilization traveled north and down the Nile, which was north, and that this high culture started among indigenous Black Africans. And this has been established through the melanin dosage test, through iconography, and through a number of other methodologies that demonstrate that the early kings from pre-dynastic times up to at least the 14th dynasty were indigenous Black Africans that came from the South. And then in later dynasties, like the 25th dynasty, there were waves of invasions of different people that came in a battle back and forth over control of ancient Egypt. But the high culture, all the elements of the high culture that made it what it is, was done under indigenous Black rule between the first and the 14th dynasty, between pre-dynastic times and 14th dynasty. So when we began to look at this history, it has, the implications for it are very profound in terms of the paradigm of the world that we've been taught and led to believe. The ancient Egyptians, we know now that they knew that the earth was round. They have found actually maps that where they've mapped out some of the continents, and it's very clear now that there's evidence that they traveled around the world at least 3 times, circumnavigated the globe. And in addition to that, we know that sometime, before 2500 BC, around that time, that a group of Black people from ancient Egypt, carrying with them the ancient Egyptian technology, traveled to the Yucatan Peninsula and established the Olmec civilization. They used the geopolymer concrete to build the Kabezi Colossus. The basalt stone heads were poured concrete. And we know that the pyramids used some of the same type of mathematical dimensions and precision that was done in ancient Egypt. And they were made from poured, not cut stones. And the building technology and techniques that were used all the way down to copper staples as a signature show that this technology was, it came from ancient Egypt. It didn't just start. And it wasn't some like ancient aliens or something like that did it. These were Black people that did it. And not only did they build this Olmec civilization in the Americas, but groups of them migrated and traveled south and developed other civilizations in the foundation of the Mayan civilizations and the Incas and the Toltecs and the Aztecs, and that all of these different groups of people, we find that there was a Black group that came in and built the foundation of the civilization and began to teach to others. And many times there were conflicts, and the Blacks would move on, but they laid a foundation for human civilization and traveled to Indonesia, in Australia, to Cambodia, to India, and they traveled all over the world and left buildings made in geopolymer concrete. They used the golden ratio. They used pi. They used the meter as a unit of measure. And we also know that, that they had ships, and they recently found like 5 huge ships buried in the sand. So these Africans had the technology to travel all over the world, and that they circumnavigated the globe at least 3 times. And they started civilizations and built structures and left their imprint upon humanity. And so the contribution of these people to world civilization and to human knowledge is very significant. If we look at the pyramids and the mathematics of the pyramids, it becomes very critical to every industry that we have today, whether it is aerospace or whatever. These Africans had developed the ability to, they knew where they were on Earth at any time, because they developed the measuring tools and measuring techniques to be able to understand their coordinates on the ground. So in terms of looking at where they were, they couldn't get lost because they understood the dimensions of the Earth, and that the Earth was round, because they were able to mathematically calculate it. And we know this now, based on evidence that has been collected over time. And so this group of people, these Africans, as the civilization was invaded over and over again, by barbarians coming in from the north and from Mesopotamia and some other areas, that this group of people traveled south. And we look at the African population, and that we can trace back the Meroitic script. If we look at the various scripts of ancient Egypt, and in the southern area of Kemet, which is the whole area is called Kemet. If we look at this, we find that these scripts were used south of the Sahara amongst Bantu-speaking people, and that these Bantu-speaking people, there's evidence, like, for example, there is, from the 4th century AD, there is a stealth in Ile-Ife in Nigeria that marks the founding of the Yoruba civilization. And they tell their own story about coming from the Nile Valley and migrating to that area and founding their civilization there. And this story is repeated over and over again by various different African civilizations south of the Sahara. We're told that, that these people didn't have any writing, that these people didn't have a real civilization or culture or whatever. But we know that all of that's a lie. It's just not true. It's stuff that was made up by Europeans to justify the atrocities committed against Black people. But if we look at this history, we know that about 95% of Black people in America, in North America, came through 79 slave ports along the west coast of Africa from Senegal to Angola. And that from these 79 slave ports, you had, for example, in Gorée Island, you had, in Senegal, you had the Serra, the Bambara, the Pilar, the Jollof people. And you had at Elmina Castle, for example, in what is now modern day Ghana, through Elmina Castle, Cape Castle, Christiansborg Castle, there was about 39 different slave ports in that region. But the Dogon people, the Ashanti people, the Akan people, the Malinke people, there were a number of different African ethnic groups that came through those ports and were taken into slavery. If we go to Nigeria, to Badagry, what we find is that you have the Yoruba, the Igbo, the Hausa people that were brought through those ports. And then we go to to the area of Cameroon, in the region below there, where there's a port called Bimbia, and through Bimbia we have the Tukulor, and we have the Kansu, we have a number of different African ethnic groups being brought through those ports. And so overall, there's over 200 African ethnic groups that were taken into slavery through these 79 ports along the west coast of Africa. Now, this doesn't talk about the Arab slave trade, where some 9 million Africans on the east coast of Africa were taken into slavery by Arabs into the so-called Middle East and in Europe and North Africa. But if we look at just West Africa and the transatlantic slave trade, and which is very well documented, that the people came through these 79 ports. So you have over 200 different African ethnic groups. And so today, the Black people in America are the descendants of these 200 African ethnic groups. And over a period of the last 500 years, we've mixed in over, and over. We didn't remain homogeneous groups where we stayed Yoruba, or we stayed Hausa, or we stayed Akan, or we stayed Jollof, or we stayed some other African ethnic group. We became an amalgam, a mixture of that. And there was also some whites and Asians and others, Native Americans, mixed in with our ethnic groups. But the vast majority of Black people are well over 60% African heritage that exists in the United States, in North America. And we began to recognize on this history that our descendancy and connection to ancient Egypt is through our being taken into slavery from Africa and being part of Bantu tribes that migrated from Nile Valley. And so we can draw the direct connection to connect us directly back to the ancient Egyptian people who created the foundations of human civilization. So you have Black people saying, oh, well, I'm a Black Hebrew. If you look at the history of ancient Egypt and the achievements of our actual ancestors, anything achieved by the Hebrews or Jews pales in comparison to the achievements of our actual ancestors. You have people saying that we are Black Asiatics and claim that we are, we came from, Mesopotamia, that from Asia, and that we're Black Asiatics. And there's no evidence to support that in the actual historical record. Everything that supports that is mythology and made up stuff. So in terms of looking at our actual history, even looking at saying that we're Moors, or we're Black Moors, or whatever, the reality is that there's no evidence that supports this theory. All of these are taking a small slither of history, a small piece of information, and then generalizing it to all Black people. So when we begin to look at that, and I'm not trying to condemn those people who say we're Black Asiatics, or that we're Black Moors, or that we're Black Jews or Hebrews, or any of those things. I think all of those were stages in consciousness in our evolution as a group of people. And they were steps toward the unraveling of information that has brought us to where we are today. It's part of an evolution in consciousness. And so it's not a criticism. It is just stating the fact that if you study beyond that and began to look at all of the actual evidence, we come from over 200 African ethnic groups that came through 79 ports, and that we are now a distinct and unique ethnic group. And whether you want to call us Black Americans or however we identify in terms of a label or a name, we are a distinct group of people now that have developed our own distinct characteristics and behaviors and norms. And we are now about 46.9 million people officially inside of the United States alone. And we are part of an African diaspora of Black people that were dispersed throughout the world, whether we are connected to Black people who are in Brazil that speak Portuguese or Dutch or French, or Black people in Central and South America, Black people that speak French, Dutch, Portuguese, English. We are a group of people that has a tragic history of the transatlantic slave trade in a brutal period of time where there was an attempt to blot out the image of God in us, to blot out our history, to blot out who we are as human beings, and to make us into chattel, property, and to deny us the status of human beings. But it's now time for us to reclaim who we are, to rediscover who we are. And as we began to look at the facts and the information that's available today and understand who we are in the context of history, we have a very important role to play in history. And we are connected to Black people in Central and South America, in the Caribbean. We are connected to Black people in Asia, and we are connected to Black people all over the planet and Africa. And Africa at this time is a rising continent. Back in 1957, Dr. Kwame Nkrumah had a inaugural celebration of the independence of Ghana as an independent African country. And over 54 independent Black nations in Africa have arisen since that time. And now those nations are struggling to develop. And we as a people in America, Black Americans, have had the opportunity to gain access to education, have had the opportunity to build the kind of knowledge and foundation that, coupled with the resources of Africa, will bring about the global rise of Black people, and that will bring about a whole transformation in the world in terms of the development of Black people, to improve our quality of life everywhere that we are on the planet. And so it's extremely important for us to begin to develop our understanding, to know our history, to understand from which we came, to begin to understand Africa. We know about European languages, and we know about European cultures, but very few of us know about African languages or African culture or African history. And we don't realize what we're missing. We don't realize the very important lessons learned from our history. And yes, there's some Africans who participated in putting Black people in slavery. And the reality is that, this is just a historical fact that we have to recognize and accept. But that doesn't mean that we don't have a right in legacy in terms of African culture, because it wasn't all of them. And many of them that participated were forced to participate at gunpoint, or their families were under threat. So when we began to look at this history and recognize who we are and where we are and whose we are, that we are a people that are abundantly blessed, And there's great opportunity before us that we have to be prepared to stand up and meet the challenges of the future. And education is critical. It is a key for us to begin to really understand and take our place and our role in human society and human civilization. We have to begin to build our families and to teach our children our history and to transmit that information to the next generation to ensure that it's passed down from generation to generation. And with that, we must be able to establish institutions that will enable us to transmit that information. We need to have rituals and a methodology, something that we do on a regular basis to bring it to remembrance. And an African Holocaust Memorial is a natural process for us because if we just take a solemn moment and have a solemn ceremony, a solemn time, that we come together and we acknowledge our past. We acknowledge the suffering of slavery. We acknowledge the period of Jim Crow. We acknowledge the period of lynching and segregation and humiliation. And we acknowledge the systemic racism that still affects us today. And we acknowledge the destruction of Africa and the millions of people killed in taking Africa into colonialism. If we began to pull together our history and be able to share it with each other and to talk about it, we'll transform this world and we'll transform the Black community. Right now, we have young people fighting against each other in the streets. We have young people strung out on drugs and involved in fighting each other over gang turfs and all kinds of negative things that are going on. Children who don't understand the value of an education because they go to school and they're confronted by a racist white teacher, or they're confronted by being given information in public schools. We have to be able to overcome all of these things by transmitting our history within our own community, under the control of our own community, and not by outsiders who don't have our interest at heart. And so I'll close by saying that it is a time for us to move forward. And Marcus Garvey, whom Dr. Martin Luther King says was one of the first Black people to organize a mass movement in modern times. Marcus Garvey said that we have a glorious history and we shall create another in the future that will astonish the world.